Welcome to Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine's fiction podcast. I'm Janet Hutchings, EQMM's editor. One of our magazine's most famous features is the Department of First Stories. In it, over the decades, many important writers in the field have gotten their start. This month we have a reading of a story from that department. Just Below the Surface, which appeared in the March-April 2017 issue of EQMM, is the fiction debut of Michigan writer Robert Shepard, and he is our reader for this podcast.
I'd heard it said that envy can be a dangerous thing, that along with it, one may expect a handful of destructive and paralyzing consequences to follow. It wasn't that I doubted this, it's just that I'd never seen it played out to an extreme before, by anybody, especially me. Unfortunately, my first real encounter with envy would launch an obsession that was to last the better part of 4 years, right up to the point when I was finally able to prove what I had suspected the whole time, that my medical school roommate, one of my oldest friends, was responsible for a murder that had occurred almost 20 years earlier. But the proof, while definitive, would come at a cost far greater than I ever could have imagined, and if there ever were a poster boy for someone who should have minded his own business, it most certainly would be me. In the fall of 2008, I received an invitation to join several other doctors and their wives for dinner at the prestigious Muninoff, located in the basement of the Renaissance Center in downtown Detroit. The doctors were gathered there for a vascular surgeons convention that had been going on all week. The keynote speaker was my medical school roommate, Dr. Richard Sherman. Sherm was one of the premier vascular surgeons in the country, and he and his surgical team were presenting half a dozen new procedures that would supposedly save many, many lives. I understood only the basics of these procedures since I was just a general practitioner in the small town of Ellery, Michigan, Dr. Nicholas Finch. I knew that the night's impending conversations had the possibility of flying far over my head, but my wife Sarah and I hadn't been out in quite some time, and I actually missed good old Sherm, even if he was a big shot now. So I accepted the invitation and we made the 2-hour drive. Sherm and I were at the top of our class during medical school in Boston. It seemed that we both had plenty of talent and drive, and the future looked incredibly bright for both of us. But as fate would have it, only Sherm would go on to complete his surgical training. I was suddenly needed elsewhere after my residency, and we parted ways. He went on to become an amazing surgeon, heading out to California and gathering his own surgical team, while I moved back to Michigan and tended to colds, influenza, and the occasional birth. What can I say? It's just the way things worked out. That night at dinner, all the physicians and their wives sat at an oval table with Sherman at the head, clearly the center of attention. He was as handsome as ever, with his perfect brown hair and tanned skin, and could easily have had a career as a model had he chosen to do so. I myself wasn't in bad shape for 37. I still had most of my hair, and I tried to take care of myself. However, my best feature was the beautiful woman to my right. There were other pretty wives at the table, but Sarah stood out like a diamond in a handful of marbles, simply stunning. We all talked and laughed, and eventually everyone came up with some old medical school tale to share. When it was my turn, I knew I had a winner. Not necessarily all that funny, but a story that would undoubtedly hold their attention. It was something that had happened to me, Sherm, and his wife Elizabeth, who was attending school in Boston with us at the time. As I was thinking of the perfect way to share this colorful story, I suddenly considered who had invited me, and if I might be overstepping my bounds by delivering the top anecdote of the evening. Under the strain of protocol, I made a fateful decision. I have a great story that happened to Sherm and me during med school, but telling stories really isn't my thing, and I think Richard could tell it better. So go ahead, Sherm. Tell him about Dr. Quest, I said. I could see he was surprised, but clearly understood my gesture as a compliment, and cleared his throat to begin. Back in '92, he said, we joined Tim Vick's fundraiser bicycle trip across the country. We started in Boston and were to end up in San Francisco. There were about 100 of us, Farmer Finch over there and my future wife included. At that time, though, Elizabeth and I weren't dating yet. Vic was third-year med and had invited med students from all over the area to come along. His little brother had died from leukemia a few years earlier, and I think he took this on as a way of dealing with it. Anyway, it was mostly guys, only a few gals, and we stopped and camped in designated spots along the way. Well, there was this dude with fire-red hair and a beard, and someone said he looked like Dr. Quest from the cartoon Johnny Quest. It kind of stuck, and everyone started calling him Dr. Quest. But after a week or so, he was getting a little pissed, so we backed off and left him alone. He was this skinny, wiry guy with what you could tell was a short fuse. It seemed like he could blow at any time. On our 9th or 10th night, we were camped out on Highway 32 in Arizona. It's this long stretch of road through the middle of the desert, hundreds of miles long. We were in this little spot with campfires and a few bottles of booze, laughing and bullshitting into the night. At around midnight, Dr. Quest, I don't remember his real name, Adam Keene, I spoke up. Sherman smiled at me. Okay, Adam Keene, a.k.a. Dr. Quest, comes flying out of his tent, flinging his arms in the air, screaming that someone ripped off his Amy Grant cassette. It was the stupidest thing ever, making such a big fuss over a tape. Anyway, he's yelling and pointing when finally someone, in their best Russian accent, says, "Don't be a fool, Dr. Quest." Everyone just loses it, and he goes nuts. F you guys. F all of you, he's screaming. He packs up all his stuff, gets on his bike, and heads west into the darkness down 32. Well, we really didn't think much of it when he didn't rejoin us the next day. We just figured he'd stopped at Phoenix and took the bus home. But when we arrived at Vic's sister's house in San Francisco, the place was swarming with cops. They interviewed each of us about what happened the night Keene left. Of course, everyone told the same story, and they let us go. We learned later that after he left that night, Keene stopped at some abandoned gas station and called his sister and his mom to wire money to Phoenix so he could fly home. But he never picked the money up, and he was never seen or heard from again. And that, my friends, is the story of the disappearing Dr. Quest. I looked around the table to see that there were a few open mouths, and one doctor even let out a "no shit." Sherman's lovely wife, Elizabeth, spoke up. They even did an episode of Unsolved Mysteries on it and interviewed a few of the cyclists, but they never found him, and it was generally assumed that he wandered off into the wilderness, and that was it. Dessert arrived, and we continued to break off into little conversations with each other. When Sherman got up to go to the men's room, Elizabeth leaned over to Sarah and me. I could still hear the shrilly voice of that idiot. Woke us up and scared the hell out of us. Us? I asked with a grin. Yeah, me and Linda LaJoyce. I must have had a confused look on my face because she asked, "Why, what's the big deal?" "I thought you and Sherm were together that night," I said. A surprised look came over her face. "Are you kidding me?" I couldn't stand that pompous ass back then. It wasn't until a year later that I agreed to go out with him. Whatever gave you that idea? Now, even though I knew exactly what had given me that idea, I decided it wasn't something I wanted to get into, and I let it go. But that one little thing would bug me for the rest of the dinner. As the evening wound down, Sherman and I pulled our chairs together and talked about his serious work and my not-so-serious work. And even though he tried not to show it, I could detect the pity he felt for me and my so-called career, which had gotten me no further than a whopping 3 miles from where I was born and raised. I almost wish he had come out and said it. "Boy, you sure have let yourself down, haven't you?" And even though he never would have said such a thing, I still felt like giving him a smack. But that was Sherman. He always had that aura of superiority. Even the most innocent of his actions came off as smug. "You still looking through those binoculars of yours?" he asked with a grin. "I just sketched a broad-billed hummingbird this morning." You ever do any bird watching anymore? Birds? Me? I'm afraid my days of bird watching are long gone. I'm so busy with the team lately that I don't have time to sleep, let alone maintain a hobby. His answer, of course, implied that I had all sorts of extra time, since I wasn't out saving the world like he was. Even in his attempt to be nice, he ended up being a prick. And yet, I had to give the guy credit. He was accomplishing some amazing things in medicine, while I could only dream of being too busy to watch birds. By the time we were halfway home, my silence must have gotten to Sarah, and she spoke up. "What's your problem, Toots?" Nothing, I said. "Yes, there is. Spill it, tough guy." "Okay, something is bothering me. Elizabeth said she was with her friend Linda that night in her tent. The night that Adam Keene disappeared, right?" "Right, I guess." "That particular night, Sherm didn't come back to our tent until 5 in the morning. When he finally came in, I woke up and asked where the hell he'd been. He smirked and said he'd rather not say. I kept after him until he finally admitted that he had enjoyed some quality time with Elizabeth in her tent. He'd been after her for months, and I figured he finally wore her down. But according to her tonight, she wouldn't have anything to do with him for some time yet." "So," she said. "So why did he lie?" "That's what's bothering you?" "Gosh, Nikki, it was 15 years ago. So either he made it up, or maybe you're mistaken. Big deal." "It just bugs me," I said. "You're a weirdo, you know, but I love you," she said, and leaned over and kissed my neck. All ideas of tents and bike rides were quickly replaced with other ideas. I put my foot down on the pedal and drove a bit faster. For quite some time, Fridays had been my busiest day of the week. My secretary, Margaret, usually tried to book in as many patients as she could before the weekend. Those patients, along with my normal walk-ins, left me with little time to think of anything outside of medicine until at least 6 p.m. But this Friday was different. I found myself occupied with something that had absolutely nothing to do with medicine. It was the same something that had bothered me the night before in Detroit, and the very first something I found in my head when I awoke that morning. I was still wondering why Richard Sherman had lied to me about his whereabouts the night Adam Keene went missing. When Sarah called me between the English classes she taught at Elsie High School, I was so preoccupied with the Sherman issue that I was unable to give her my full attention, and after a couple of minutes she let me go. Halfway through the day, an unsettling feeling concerning Sherman's lie began to make its way into my consciousness, piecing itself together hour by hour. By early afternoon, some pretty ugly ideas were bouncing around in my head. But as persuasive as they were, I tried my hardest to reject them, mainly because I had to. Such things just couldn't have happened. By 6 o'clock, 27 patients later, I'd done everything possible to shake the idea that my friend Richard Sherman had killed Adam Keene that night in Arizona so many years ago, and yet my instincts were leaning the other way. For the next few days, I tried to come up with any reason in the world why Sherman would have lied about that night, but nothing I came up with made much sense. I just couldn't figure it. And there was something else bothering me now as well. Something about his rendition of Adam Keene's disappearance. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I had the feeling there was more to the story that Sherman had told everyone that night. Something specific that furthered the notion that he knew the truth about Adam Keene. A few nights later, after Sarah had gone to bed to read, I broke out the old pictures of my medical school days and started looking for any that were taken on Tim Vick's bike trip. I was certain I had a few, and after searching through a shoebox, I found them. There were 13 pictures in all, and I looked over each and every one very carefully. At first I could find nothing out of the ordinary, and thought I'd crapped out. But then something caught my attention. I quickly flipped back through the photos and zeroed in on 3 in particular and studied them for several minutes, and then it hit me. I had finally found something that supported my hunch. I grabbed the pictures and ran up to my bedroom and jumped on the bed by Sarah. "Here," I said, "I want you to see something." "What the heck are you doing?" she cried. I could tell that I had ticked her off by interrupting her reading, but I didn't care. I needed her to see what I saw, and I needed her to tell me I wasn't crazy. "Look at these 3 pictures in this order," I said as I handed her the photos. In the first picture, you could see me and Sherman mugging for the camera, just as we were about to start the ride. We're standing next to our bikes, smiling our asses off. Now, look at the next photo. This was taken about halfway through the trip, in front of some old saloon. Notice our bikes again. Now look at this last picture. Here we are just moments after we arrived at our destination in San Francisco. Look again at the bikes. Now, what do you see? Can you see anything different in these pictures?" She took a minute and examined the photos closely, and finally looked at me with a puzzled face. "I'm sorry, Nick. What am I supposed to be seeing here?" I wasn't upset that she didn't catch it. After all, it was a very small and almost unnoticeable thing, and yet it was there. Look at the pack over Sherm's rear tire. A sleeping bag, our tent, another bag, and it's all on top of a military-type folding shovel. Okay, look at the next picture. There it is again. Same pack, same shovel. Now look at the last one. Same pack, but now the shovel is gone. You see? Yep, I see it now. And your point is what? He lost his shovel, Sarah. How? What happened to it? She looked as though she might be starting to read the direction I was heading in, but still had a perplexed look on her face. "Nick, what are you trying to say?" "I'm saying this, Sarah. This is just another thing that points to what really happened that night in Arizona." "Which is what?" "That Richard killed Adam Keene, quite possibly with this shovel." There, I'd said it, and I didn't feel as crazy as I thought I would once I came out with it. "Are you nuts?" Her face suddenly had an expression that I'd only seen when she was about to deliver a skillful line of sarcasm. Now I did feel crazy. "This is what you pulled me out of my book for? How long has this been rattling around in that head of yours?" I almost felt ashamed to talk about it any further, but since I had said this much, I figured I'd lay all my cards on the table. "Ever since the dinner party, it's been eating at me. He did it, Sarah, I know he did. I could feel it in my gut. He lied about where he was, and now he's missing his shovel. He did it. And there's something else that I can't put my finger on yet, but I'm sure I'm right about this." She stared at me like I was an escaped mental patient for a good 20 seconds before she calmly closed her book and put it down. She sat up in our bed, removed her glasses, cupped my face in her hands, and pulled me close to her. "Nicholas, I'm pretty sure where this is coming from. You have always been envious of Richard, and you know it. You're jealous because he was able to become everything you didn't. And I know it's not your fault. Your dad died, and you had to run the farm and take care of Mom. You never completed your surgical training. You just became a doctor. But there is no just in that title. You are a wonderful doctor, and you help a great many people and should hold your head up. But please, if you are unable to hold your head up for whatever crazy, prideful reason, do not take it out on Richard Sherman just because he does. Now my suggestion to you is that you worry about yourself and drop this nonsense." She kissed my forehead, rolled over, and turned off her lamp, and the room was dark. The subject of murder was now closed, and Sarah and I were never to speak of it again. That's how we operated. As long as something wasn't brought up again, it was forgotten and we moved on. Probably not the best way to resolve our occasional issues, but it worked for us, so we stuck with it. So as far as Sarah knew, this whole Arizona deal was no longer a deal. But I sure as hell didn't feel that way. I tried pouring myself into my work to occupy my mind with anything and everything. I even asked Margaret to restructure our caseload so I could fit in more patients per day, allowing me to be available at a free clinic in Lansing 1 day a week. It was a different world of medicine, and I found it challenging and very fulfilling. And the clinic itself was only a block away from the Spartan Bird Emporium, a state-funded sanctuary for every imaginable bird located in and around Michigan. Part of it was inside and part outside, with large screen scaffolding to keep the birds in the man-made forest. I ate lunch there every chance I could and completed at least one sketch per visit. I also took on the task of remodeling our house and found myself busier than I'd ever been. But no matter how much I added to my plate, I was unable to push Arizona out of my mind, and I still harbored the odd feeling that I was missing something that could once and for all prove that I wasn't crazy. I was, however, settling into the idea that I'd never find out what that thing was, but that would soon change. One night in the summer of 2009, I was in my recliner flipping through the channels when a rerun of Unsolved Mysteries caught my eye. I started watching it, and it reminded me of the episode that was made about Adam Keene. I remembered that I had actually recorded that episode on a VHS tape years ago and tried to recall where I'd put it. 10 minutes later, I was digging through boxes that were stored up in the attic. After rummaging through 5 of them, I located the tape of the show. It took me a while longer to locate and hook up my old VCR. It played as the third story on the episode, and I watched intensely, waiting for something I'd missed to jump off the screen, but nothing did. The facts were as I'd remembered them. Even so, for some reason, I decided to watch it again and again. Then, on the 5th viewing, I realized something that I hadn't before. The show's narration was missing a very small but specific fact that Richard Sherman's account had included that night during dinner. Nowhere in the episode did it mention anything about the sister of Adam Keene receiving a phone call. It stated that a couple of calls were made from the abandoned gas station and that the mother had agreed to wire money to a Western Union in Phoenix, but nothing specific about a call to a sister. Yet I remembered very clearly that Sherman's version included a call to Keene's sister and then a call to his mom. Was this the thorn that had been sticking in my side for so long? If so, how could it be of any importance? I started the coffee maker. I spent the rest of the night on the computer looking up everything I could find on the story. I located more than I thought I would. However, after reading through every single version of the Adam Keene story, I could find no mention of a phone call to a sister. It was then I concluded that either Sherman was mistaken and I was running down a dead end, or he knew of a phone call from Keene to his sister that nobody else did. Now the big question, was it true, and could I prove it? It took me about an hour to hatch a plan that could possibly provide an answer to my own little unsolved mystery. I wrote a letter to the Arizona State Police. My words and instructions were simple and to the point. Dear Sirs, I may have an idea who was involved in the disappearance of Adam Keene over 15 years ago off of Highway 32. If you confirm a piece of information, I will pass his name on to you. Please run an ad in the Saturday edition of the Detroit Free Press for a lime green freezer for sale. Then state whether or not Adam Keene made a phone call to his sister the night he went missing. Include whether or not that information has ever been made public. The following morning, I overnighted the letter to make sure it would arrive in plenty of time to get the ad in by Saturday. That's if they were willing to play along. By the time Saturday came around, I'd convinced myself that my little cloak and dagger stunt would end up being a complete wash. Still, I opened the Detroit Free Press with some anticipation on the remote chance that my letter had stirred some interest. And then I saw it, the response I had requested, a lime green freezer for sale. It read, yes, a call to the SIS. No, only 2 people outside of the investigators have ever known about it. Please contact us immediately. And there it was, proof. At least proof enough to finally validate my suspicions. He did it. He killed Adam Keene. Now, how exactly was I going to handle it? As much as I could, I wanted to avoid getting directly involved in Richard Sherman's path to justice. I'd supply the police with the results of my detective work, and then I'd be out of it. But how would this be possible? After all, Sherman was smart enough to figure out who was behind the whole thing. Who else would have turned him in? His wife? He'd know it was me. Not only that, with his charm and stature, it was very likely that in no time he'd have everyone convinced he was innocent, therefore leaving me to assume the role of asshole, the guy who was falsely accusing this great man of such a despicable crime. Suddenly the whole thing seemed like it might turn into a huge embarrassment. After all these possibilities flipped through my mind, I determined that the only way for me to successfully turn this over to the authorities was if I was to also present some sort of proof that Adam Keene was, in fact, dead. And this meant producing a body, which I was pretty sure would be impossible. How in God's name could I ever find the remains of Adam Keene? After a few days, I began to believe that it wasn't as impossible as I'd first thought. The way I figured it, Sherman must have buried him, which gave me an idea. I called Tim Vick, the man who had organized the bike ride so many years ago. After some catching up on our careers, I got to my point and laid it on thick. Well, here's the deal, Tim. Sherman and I are arguing over who raised the most money on that bike trip back in '92. He says he smoked me, but I think I won. Would you happen to have the log of our miles and the log of our sponsors? I remembered Tim checking our odometers when we started and again when we finished. If I was right, and Sherman killed Keene, maybe his final odometer tally would show how many extra miles he rode from camp that night to kill him. All of this was pretty remote, of course, yet it stood to reason that he'd have more miles than me on his total trip if he used his bike to go after Keene that night. Let me see, Nick. Gee, I'm thinking that may have been in one of the boxes that got burned up a few years ago in my garage. It burned to the ground, and I lost a bunch of stuff. I'll check, but I think it's toast, Tim said apologetically. Well, it was worth a try, I answered. We promised to stay in closer touch with each other and said our goodbyes. It was then that I felt my detective work had come to an end. Richard Sherman had gotten away with murder, and I was the only other person in the world who knew this. Almost a year had passed after my conversation with Tim Vick, and I was convinced he'd found nothing, just like he thought he would. But then, on one of my Saturdays at the office, a large envelope arrived from Vick, and my role as detective was instantly revived. I opened the package and found 3 pieces of paper. One was a handwritten letter that read, "I found these in my brother's garage last week and made copies for you. Sorry, looks like you lose the bet, buddy, but we can keep it between us if you want. Ha ha. Regards, Tim." There were copies of the bike trip mileage log and the sponsor tallies. For certain, Richard Sherman was the winner. He had raised twice as much money as I had. But that's not what I was interested in. It was the mileage log, which could possibly tell me where he had killed and buried Adam Keene. Sure enough, after a few calculations, I determined that Sherman had 14.6 more miles on his odometer tally than I did. I tried to come up with an explanation that could account for this extra mileage. However, I remembered vividly that he and I were side by side the entire trip, never going off on individual routes. Therefore, there could be but one explanation. Sherman had gone somewhere without me knowing about it, and if my arithmetic was correct, that particular somewhere would turn out to be 7.3 miles from our campsite the night of the disappearance. That's where I imagined he killed Adam Keene and buried him, 7.3 miles west on Highway 32. With each passing day, my desire to become Adam Keene's gavel of justice increased. So much, in fact, that I began looking for an excuse to leave town for a few days so I could pursue my body hunt in Arizona. I was slowly working up the nerve to perpetrate this enormous deception on my wife, and had every intention of doing so until the morning of my 39th birthday. That morning I arrived at my office and turned on the lights in the lobby. I noticed a large gift-wrapped picture frame hanging on the wall instantly, and walked over to it and removed the card that was attached. It read, "I wanted to give you something very special. You are a beautiful, caring man, and I love you, Nicky. Sarah." I tore away the wrapping paper and marveled at what my wife had done for me. It was an enlarged photograph that I vaguely remembered from when I was a teen, a framed black and white picture of my dad in the distance, with his back to the camera and his hands on his hips, overlooking a mature field of corn behind the house I grew up in. In the lower right-hand corner, Sarah had these words added, "He stands at the edge of the field, looking over all he had planted, and as the fall corn blows, he remembers why he's chosen this life, and why he'll forever recite the verse of a farmer." I recognized the words as those my father had written years ago after he became ill with cancer. I sat down and just stared at this beautiful tribute that my Sarah had given me to honor the man I would always respect more than anyone. It was then and there that I decided I could not lie to this wonderful woman, and vowed to let the Arizona thing go. And I did, but sadly, it wouldn't be for long. 4 months later, Margaret brought something to my attention on her computer. It was an article about the newest Nobel Prize nominees. There it was, the name of my old medical school roommate, nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. It even quoted the great man. I accept this nomination on behalf of my father, Dr. Dennis Sherman, who encouraged me to spend my life helping others and to always make that my first priority. I felt sick to my stomach. A few days later, I told Sarah there was a surgical seminar in Denver that I wanted to attend the following week. As I expected, she was unable to go with me because of her teaching schedule. When she apologized, I told her it was okay, that there would be other opportunities for her to join me. Of course, I had no more intention of seeing Denver than she did. I packed my bags, kissed her goodbye, drove myself to Detroit Metro, and boarded Flight 265 to Phoenix. Everything looked pretty much as I remembered it. Nothing had really changed at all. There I stood, just off Highway 32, looking over the place we'd camped that fateful night. It looked as though people still stayed there from time to time. The remains of freshly burned-out campfires were scattered throughout the 2-acre parcel. I walked to the spot where I remembered our tent being pitched and sat down on the hard, dry ground and looked to the west. Down that road, approximately 7.3 miles, was where I hoped to find something of added keen. I got back into the Yukon that I'd rented and set the trip counter to 0 and started west. At 6 miles, I passed an abandoned gas station. At 7.2 miles, I could see a small opening off the road just ahead, and exactly 7.3 miles, I pulled over directly in front of it. It appeared to be very similar to our campsite, except half as large. I maneuvered the truck around some large rocks so that it wouldn't be so visible from the road. It was 10 a.m. and 85 degrees. I looked over the small camp area and noticed that a large row of rocks divided the site from the endless desert to the north. When I reached the rocks, I observed that there was a good 15-foot drop down to the desert floor. The ground below looked smooth and loose, a terrific place to bury something that you never wanted found. I returned to the Yukon, opened the trunk, and pulled out the metal detector I'd rented in Phoenix, and a shovel. I headed down a slope to the flat ground just on the other side of the rock wall, laid the shovel down, put on the headphones that came with the metal detector, and went to work. I adjusted the controls so the detector would pick up something large, like a 10-speed, and began next to the rock wall, fanning my way north, heading farther into the desert with each pass. I was only 25 minutes into my search when the beeper went off and I began to dig. Drenched with sweat, I finally hit an oil drum that had probably been there for 50 years. Happy with the settings on the metal detector, I buried the barrel and continued. By 3 p.m., the sun had disappeared into the dark clouds that now covered most of the sky. I sat down on the rock wall, wiped my sweaty face, and chugged a large bottle of water. I tried to imagine Sherman digging an impromptu grave for the lifeless body of Adam Keene. As I did, I drifted back into a question I'd given quite a bit of thought. Why was this man murdered? What was it that drove an easygoing guy like Richard Sherman to do such a thing? As the winds picked up and the temperature dropped, I buzzed through half a dozen reasons for him to have killed Keene, none of which was believable. Eventually, I dismissed them all and got back to work. By 6:15, I was considering calling it a day. I had covered at least 3 acres and had found nothing. I marked my spot with a stick and started toward the truck. As soon as I reached the rock wall, I saw flashing lights. An Arizona state trooper had parked his car behind mine and was getting out as I approached. Surprisingly, I wasn't nervous. I was confident that the simplest of explanations would set the trooper's mind at ease. "How we doing today?" he asked. "Coming up empty," I answered. I felt a few sprinkles starting to come down. "What are you looking for?" the young trooper asked. "Well, it's a long shot, but I lost my dad's watch a year ago on a bike trip, and I'm checking all the places I camped," I said. "Can I see some identification, and I'll let you get back to your hunt?" he asked politely. Sure enough, I reached into my wallet and handed him my license and my rental agreement for the Yukon, and he walked back and sat in his car. I calmly sipped my water as I waited. After a few minutes, he got out and walked back to me. "Well, Dr. Finch, looks like you're all set," he said, handing me back my things. "I hope you find your watch. Oh, please be careful. When the sun goes down, this desert can be tricky," he said with a wink, and got back in his car and drove away. I let out a sigh of relief and decided I'd give my search just one more hour. I headed back to the point I'd marked with the stick and clicked the detector back on as a light mist continued to fall. 10 minutes later, the detector went off, and the tone indicated that it was something large. I began to dig. Every foot or so, I'd check with the metal detector and was able to determine that my area of interest was 5 to 6 feet in diameter. I felt an odd sense of excitement building up in me as I continued to dig deeper and deeper. At just about 4 feet, I hit metal. I could tell that not only was it metal, but it was fairly solid. I gently began to remove the dirt around what was appearing to be a structure that included many angles and connections. A minute later, I could make out the form of a bicycle. I pulled out my pocket flashlight and shined it on one of the larger shafts and could see flecks of orange paint still left on the frame. Adam Keene's bike was orange, just like his hair. I carefully continued to uncover the bike frame until I was able to lift the whole thing out. But as I lifted, I could see that one of the wheels was caught on something. I scooped away more dirt and uncovered what was lodged in the spokes of the rear tire. There, with a few corroded strands of cloth still wrapped around it, lay the bones of a human foot. I knew it was the foot of Adam Keene, and now I had my indisputable proof. I sat down on a nearby rock and stared down into the grave of a man who had been dead for nearly 20 years. I sat there as the full moon became brighter between the fast-moving clouds. To the west, I saw a ferruginous hawk. It circled closer and closer, finally landing on the edge of the hole I'd dug. I watched as his head cocked from side to side, looking curiously around and into the hole. After a minute, I pulled my eyes from the great bird and looked down into the final resting place of that red-headed young man left there by Richard Sherman. I even had to laugh at one point, considering the circumstances that had led me to where I now was. It was amazing to think that it had all started with a simple dinner party, and now I sat there, alone, with dirt under my fingernails from digging up a corpse. The hawk looked in my direction for a few seconds and then flew away. It was all pretty simple for him, I thought. I continued to sit there as the skies turned darker, and then I made a decision that I will probably regret for the rest of my life. I took out my phone and called the man who was responsible for the dead body that lay just a few feet from me. I wasn't sure if he'd even answer, but surprisingly, he did. "Nick, what's up, plowboy?" "Well, Sherm, I just called to let you know where I am and what I'm looking at," I said. "Okay, lay it on me," he said. I cleared my throat to deliver what I assumed would be the last words in the world he would ever expect me to say. I am exactly 7.3 miles west of the campsite we used the night Adam Keene went missing. I'm about 35 yards off of Old Highway 32, sitting on the edge of a hole that I dug. Do you know what's in this hole in front of me? I have a pretty good idea, he quietly answered. That's right, Dr. Sherman. It's what's left of Adam Keene, the man you killed. Sherman didn't say anything, but I could hear his gentle sighs. I will, of course, be contacting the police, but I'd like to ask you something before I do that. Why? Why do this? For a second, I thought he'd hung up, but then I heard his defeated voice. It's a very private and personal matter, and I don't feel that I owe you or anyone else an explanation. A personal matter? What in the hell could that possibly mean, Richard? You killed a man. There can be no excuse for that, I said. Whatever you say, Nick, whatever you say. Let's just agree that you don't have any idea what this is about and leave it at that. So, you do what you want to, not what you have to. Don't you dare tell me that you have to call the police. You want to, just like you must have wanted to pursue this whole thing. I can only imagine how many hours, days, and years you've spent on this to finally get your answer, he said. Don't even think of making me out to be the bad guy here, Richard. You murdered a man in cold blood, not me, I hollered back. Okay, Nick, I'll make you a deal. You tell me why you did this, and I'll tell you why I did what I did, he said. Did what? I cried. Why I did what? This. All of this, searching, digging, trying to find anything you could to prove what you wanted to, he said. What the hell do you mean, what I wanted to? Are you seriously turning this thing around? My God, you are insane, I said. Like I said, Nick, do what you want. It's not what you have to do, it's what you want to do. You wanted me to be the killer. You wanted to dig up that body. And you wanted to make this phone call so you could tell me that you finally won, he said. What sort of crap are you shoveling? I won? It means this, Nick. You were forced to leave your surgical training, and you had to settle for the career you have. I, on the other hand, have achieved the success that you believe you were entitled to, and you despise me for that. You always have. And it's that resentment and envy that has driven you to try and take away from me the success that you've never had. So you're sitting exactly where you're sitting and looking at what you're looking at because you feel the need to punish me. That is the truth. And if you ask me, you are in need of some serious therapy. I could not believe what I was hearing. You crazy bastard. Just because your puppets out in California take every word you say as gospel doesn't mean I do. You killed a man. Yep. And you know what? I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Why, Richard? Why? If you confess your motives for digging up my sins, I'll tell you why. Admit it, he said. I wasn't for 1 second buying into his horse shit about my motives, at least not entirely. But I needed more than ever to hear his reasons. Obviously, he felt justified because he had just said he'd do it again in a heartbeat. So now I absolutely had to know. I decided that I'd agree with his theory of my motives, even though I knew he was wrong, just as Sarah had been wrong. However, my so-called admission concerning the reasons for my detective work would need to sound sincere and heartfelt, or he'd realize I was just trying to get him to spill his guts. I'll admit that I wish I had a career half as successful as yours, Richard, I said, certain this would be believable to him. I sat silent and waited for him to tell me why he killed Adam Keene. You are the only person I will ever tell this to, no matter what happens from this point on. It's a family secret that nobody knows about. Before my family moved to Boston, we lived in D.C. for about 6 years in a gated community where many of the yards backed up to each other. When I was 16, my little sister fell out of our treehouse and was knocked unconscious. Nobody saw it except a neighbor kid. He was 18 years old, and he dragged her behind our shed and raped her while she was still knocked out. She was only 13 at the time. She woke up screaming, and my mom sprinted out of the house to find this little bastard on top of my sister. He took off running, and she called an ambulance and the police. They went to question the boy, but didn't arrest him because his daddy was the county's prosecuting attorney at the time. And, as unbelievable as it may seem, the whole thing was swept under the rug, and that punk never got as much as a verbal reprimand, not 1 ounce of punishment. My sister spent the next several years in therapy and was eventually institutionalized, where she remains to this day. It's something that injured my family terribly. Oh, by the way, the name of the young man who raped my sister was Adam Keene. So when I recognized him on our bike trip, I began my struggle to keep myself from getting even with the little prick. He didn't remember me, probably because he went to a private school and we never really had much contact. And I had that goofy mustache back in medical school as well. So that night, when he took off in such a fit, something in me snapped, and I went after him. The rest is, well, as they say, history. Suddenly, I felt sympathy and pain for Sherman and his family, and at that moment, his analysis of my motives seemed to have merit. It was as though all of his statements about me resenting him and being envious of his career were now not only believable, but true. I felt horrible and did the only thing I could do in good conscience. Listen, Richard, I had no idea, and I am truly sorry. I can't say that I blame you for what you did, I said. I waited for a response, but could only hear him sniffle a bit and realize that he was crying. That child-molesting little prick! I hope he's burning in hell, he shouted. Let's just forget about this, and I'll rebury the past, okay? I said. It took a second for Sherman to get his composure. That's fine with me, Nicky. So, you and I are good? Better than you know, I answered. I no longer felt any resentment or envy, and it was as though a bag of sand had been lifted off of my heart. I felt free from this whole mess now, and I assured Richard that he was free as well. It will never be brought up again, Richard. I promise, I said, and we ended our call, and I began shoveling dirt, thereby making myself an accessory to murder after the fact. An hour later, I was on my way home. Considering the circumstances surrounding it, my part in this whole matter was fairly easy to deal with. Before long, I was back on track with my practice and my work at the free clinic. I began to experience a sense of happiness and accomplishment, especially when, one sunny day, almost a year after my trip to Arizona, Sarah came to me with the news that she was finally pregnant. All the good things in my life were opening my eyes to just how much damage this whole Adam Keene thing had been causing. I had a new outlook and a new beginning to my life. And then I received a phone call from Tim Vick. Dr. Timothy Vick had always been the beacon for news and gossip concerning the personal matters of members of our medical school class. Who was getting married, who had divorced, who was doing this or that. His news this day was that Dr. Richard Sherman had been killed in a single-engine plane crash the day before off the coast of San Francisco, and that the funeral would be in Boston in 3 days. I told Sarah the bad news, and we made our plans to head east. It was Richard's brother, Alan, who delivered the eulogy. Alan was a neurologist, still practicing in Boston, and dutifully listed everything his younger brother had accomplished. I listened loosely while I looked around the room at the reactions to Richard's phenomenal achievements. Then Alan went into an area that suddenly grabbed every bit of my attention. He spoke about his family history, and how he and his brother were fourth-generation physicians, and how Richard was the only one in the family to leave the Boston area, and was therefore jokingly labeled the black sheep, a point that drew laughs from the large crowd. I didn't laugh, however. I was a bit confused and knew that I needed to speak to Alan after the funeral. It was at the dinner in the church rectory that I was finally able to get a minute with Alan Sherman. While Sarah ate a plateful of funeral food, I took Alan out into the hall. I offered my condolences and eased into my inquiry. "Did your family ever live in Washington, D.C.?" I asked the shorter, fatter version of Richard. "Nope, we've been in Boston for a couple of 100 years, he answered while shoveling mashed potatoes into his mouth from the plate he was holding. "Let me ask you, do you have a sister?" "Nope, all brothers, 6 of us. Why? You don't have a sister who was institutionalized several years ago?" "Nick, I don't know where you're getting this from, but you got us mixed up with some other family," he said with a laugh. "I guess so," I said, and joined Sarah back at our table. I didn't want anything more to do with Richard Sherman or his family. I didn't even give a shit what his real reason for killing Adam Keene was. It would just remain a mystery forever, and not one that I'd ever allow to bother me again. Sarah and I left Boston later that day and were back home in our little town by midnight. It was in the fall of 2013 that Sarah and I and our little boy were on our way home from a vacation in Traverse City, and the NPR news on the radio grabbed my attention. There was a story that detailed arrests being made in Phoenix, Arizona, because of a rally on the Capitol steps that had gotten out of hand. What started out as a peaceful protest turned violent when the police started making arrests for trespassing. Before you knew it, nightsticks were swinging, and 26 protesters were locked up for showing their disappointment over the renovation of Old Highway 32. Construction had begun 2 months earlier on the stretch as far east as 70 miles from Phoenix, and now the state wanted to extend the renovation an additional 60 miles. The 2-lane would now be a 4-lane, with 50 yards of landscaping on either side, and the protesters were upset with the idea of even more changes being made to the nostalgic highway. I quickly realized that the stretch of road where Adam Keene's body was buried was now already under construction. This was very bad, and something I couldn't have predicted in a million years. As I drove toward home, I tried not to let Sarah see how concerned I'd become the very second I heard the news. After going over all the possibilities, I concluded there was a chance that the body wouldn't be discovered, that perhaps it was out far enough so it wouldn't be bothered. I also believed there was a chance that the officer who ran a check on me wouldn't be working for the state of Arizona any longer, or that he'd have forgotten the encounter he had with a doctor, a metal detector, and a shovel. But even with all these possibilities I was trying to talk myself into, I remained fearful of what I suspected would really happen, that the officer who met me that evening in the desert would catch wind that a body had been uncovered and would easily recall the encounter with me. Since he ran my name, it would be on record that Dr. Nicholas Finch was in the immediate area where the body was found, with a shovel. Those facts alone would probably be enough to get a warrant in the works, but once the identity of the body was known, finding out that Adam Keene and Nicholas Finch were part of the same bike trip wouldn't take too long. And even if I could eventually convince the authorities that I didn't kill Adam Keene, I would still be arrested for acting as an accomplice after the fact by not turning Richard Sherman in. So now it was just a waiting game to see if the body would be found and if I would be linked to it. 3 months later, I was sitting on the bench at the Bird Emporium and enjoying the 3 new additions that had been brought in a week earlier: the scarlet tanager, the pileated woodpecker, and the cedar waxwing. All 3 were incredibly sketch-worthy, and I pulled out my pad and began to draw the cedar waxwing first. His impressive brow was low and gave him distinction beyond the other 2. It was as though his beauty demanded that he should be drawn first. As I sketched the bird with my colored pencils, I noticed a shade of pink in the bird's color that hadn't been so prominent just seconds earlier. Then I noticed that the saturation of the pink didn't appear entirely consistent. As I looked closer, I could make out that the colors actually seemed to be changing, caused by something reflecting off the bird. Suddenly it became evident that a pinkish red was consistently flashing off the bird's feathers. It took only a few more seconds for me to figure out what was going on and exactly what was reflecting off the beautiful bird. I stood up and turned around to face 3 police cars just outside the glass doors, and I could see at least 4 officers walking around the perimeter to surround me. I knew what was happening. It was exactly what I had feared. I looked back to the branch where the cedar waxwing had been sitting to find that he was gone. I closed my sketch pad and put the pencils back in the little box that I always carry them in and slowly walked toward the officers. As I said in the beginning, this will probably end up being more costly than I ever could have imagined, and while I can't say for certain that my goose is cooked, I have a bad feeling that this whole mess just isn't going to work out so well for me. My wife told me that I should worry about myself and forget this whole Adam Keene nonsense. So, why didn't I?
Just Below the Surface is copyrighted by Robert Shepard. Music for the podcast is by M. Jantz and was obtained from the community audio section of the Internet Archive. Mixing for the podcast was done by Jackie Sherbo. You can subscribe to Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, where you'll find more stories like this one by visiting our website at www.themysteryplace.com/EQMM.